Ben Schafer, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for our Innovation Wednesday episodes, we highlight new ventures from the Harvard student alumni community. And Ben Schafer is co-founder of MicroAvionics. Let's just dive right in. What is MicroAvionics?
So we are a spin out of the School of Engineering here at Harvard, and we are making very lightweight structures that levitate when you shine light on them. So this is kind of a new propulsion mechanism that's come out of our research, and you could use it to loft payloads in a region of the atmosphere that's too high for planes to fly, but too low for satellites to orbit. So it's really kind of an unexplored region of near space.
And so this mechanism you're saying is like light will provide the energy and your technology will levitate.
That's right.
That sounds something out of course, science fiction. So why did you decide to build this venture?
Oh, that's a long question to answer. So I think we should go back to when I was looking at grad schools. I got in touch with my current advisor, David Keith, who is kind of like the godfather of geoengineering. So he does a lot of work studying ways in which you could temporarily reduce the amount of sunlight that reaches Earth. The most studied way of doing that would be to inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. And these aerosols would act like little mirrors that basically reflect some sunlight back into space. And it's a pretty small amount, less than 1%. But that's enough to actually cool the Earth substantially. And that gives us a temporary way of counteracting global warming. Mm-hmm. It's not a permanent fix, but it gives us some time to try to decarbonize. So how does that relate to what we're currently doing? Well, about 15 years ago, David Keith wrote this paper that said you could use engineered aerosols to act like little mirrors and reflect sunlight back into space. These structures would levitate in place in the stratosphere using something called photophoresis, which is this obscure physics mechanism. But basically, it means that you shine light on an object. Mm-hmm. That object develops a temperature gradient inside of it, and that temperature gradient gives creates an airflow around the structure itself that pushes it in a single direction. So you could create little particles that basically heat up under sunlight and then create an airflow that keeps them aloft. So that was 15-ish years ago. When I started at Seas about 6 years ago, I was looking for a project that kind of combined my love for physics and my love or my passion for solving climate challenges.
Right.
And this was a great match. So, I talked with David about it and we decided that I would work on this. Around that time, there was some really interesting nanofabrication work being done and led by a group out of University of Pennsylvania that showed you could actually make bigger structures than just micro scale aerosols and levitate them. So the research question that David and I really wanted to answer was, could you use this mechanism to loft these bigger structures in the atmosphere? And doing so would allow you to put meaningful payloads in near space. So that's what I've been studying for the past 6 years as a PhD candidate, just finishing up now. And what MicroAvionics is doing is we're taking the knowledge that we've acquired over the past 6 years and targeting it towards actually levitating useful payloads in near space. So, as I said, this is a region of the atmosphere that nothing else can fly. We're building the only hardware that can fly in really the upper half of the atmosphere. So what can you loft on these things? Well, we're looking at lofting climate sensors or atmospheric sensors that would give you really useful data for improving the accuracy of climate models and for doing weather prediction. We're looking at lofting telecoms hardware. So you could use these basically as a way to communicate to and from the ground and from satellites. And one nice thing is that because you're still in the atmosphere, you're much lower than low Earth orbit, where most communication satellites like Starlink operate. So you have 1/5 the latency of those satellites, which is
the distance.
That's right. Yeah. So you have you can move signals back and forth with like 5 times the speed. And lastly, there are defense applications, which the DoD is going to
enjoy,
do with the product what they will. So
certainly. Well, diving into like, imagine this. I mean, you're talking, micro particles, right? How small is that? Like, is that and the levitation aspect is like, it's not like mini engines or anything. How would it actually be seen or not be seen, I guess, if it's so small? Like, and what is the payload aspect? So like, you're mentioning aerosols, that's, atoms, very small, but what is a meaningful payload to you that potentially could be achievable for the company?
Mm-hmm. So, aerosols are around the micron scale. And that's what the original structures that David wrote about, that's roughly how wide they would be. But we've actually shown you can levitate things as wide as a centimeter. So those structures and the prototypes that we built in lab can levitate about hundreds of micrograms. We're looking to scale up to tens, hundreds of milligrams in the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
And the long-term goal would be to come up with ideas for lofting kilogram scale payloads. So you could actually start to rival like atmospheric balloons and satellites in terms of payload capacity. Even though we're on the milligram scale right now, that still gives you a lot of leeway in terms of useful payloads. So there are sensors and antennas in our phone that fit in that milligram scale payload capacity. So there's still interesting things that we can do with it right now.
Absolutely.
But you obviously have a bigger product scope if you scale up. You can do more interesting things. But yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think of like, if we view like a technology tree, you're on the bleeding edge of unlocking this new technology essentially. So, and with any technology, you're going to scale up. So that's very exciting for our, audience. A lot of them are founders or people interested in entrepreneurship. You had this idea, this research, and a lot of these brilliant, innovations come out of a lot of research in academic institutions, but translating that into a viable enterprise is a whole different story. So tell us about how you decided to turn this into a company, right? Versus just kind of more of a research oriented. What was the transition for that in your mind?
Yeah, well, for a while, I didn't really think of it as, I didn't think a company was anything I wanted to do. I would say it really started turning last year. So, I went through my co-founder and I went through the National I-Corps program. And through that, we met a lot of people that seemed really interested in this kind of technology. And we talked to some space people, some telecoms people, some climate people. Combining that interest with positive results we were seeing in lab, we said, wait a minute, we could actually try to build something here that would be useful to people. So that was kind of the turning point. But for 4 or 5 years, I didn't really think that would ever be the case. I was just kind of planning on going into industry and that would be that. But it's been pretty rewarding so far. And we've only been around for like 6 or 8 months.
Which is absolutely fantastic. And, no venture can be achievable without some sort of funding. And so for MicroAvionics and your efforts leading up to it, you and your partner, Angela, have received nearly $1 million in non-dilutive funding, which is extremely impressive. Tell us about how you achieved that and, what specific aspects of those fundings are really being deployed for.
Sure. So some of that funding was really for the core research that's been done here at Harvard. So 5-ish years ago, David Keith and Jos Vlasic were my PIs. They were awarded the Star Friedman grant for promising scientific research, I think it is. And that really helped propel this research for the past 4-ish years. Recently, we got a fellowship from New Mexico LEAP, which is a program out of Los Alamos National Laboratory. That's funding for 2 years, and we're going to start integrating with them this summer. That's funding for 2 years. It's a credo with them, and we're really looking forward to starting that development. But we've also been involved with things here at the iLab. So, for instance, we're winners now of the Ingenuity Award. We've gotten some Spark grants. They've been super helpful in everything that we've done so far. And let's see, we were part of, there's the National Security Innovation Network's Emerge program.
Mm-hmm.
So this is for academic spinouts that have dual use applications. So we just finished with them, got to meet a lot of really interesting people in the DoD. Yeah, I think those are the major things. Oh, and NSF I-Corps. So that was funding to do a bunch of customer discovery.
Very cool. And yeah, for our audience, dual use is when you have civilian or commercial and military application, which like a lot of space ventures like Elon Musk with SpaceX, you do both. And Boeing, even though their commercial side is not great right now in selling airplanes, they have a very viable defense side for their business. You've raised this funding. A lot of it has gone towards the discovery, towards building the business, solidifying it. In traditional venture capital, you raise a round, where you go to venture capital firms, you raise X amount in exchange for some share of your company. Is that the pathway that you're thinking about, or is that something in the near future for yourself, for a potential like scaling of your venture, the runway itself, or is there a different approach that you're thinking about this?
I think VC funding, it's definitely something we'll pursue probably in a year-ish time. I forgot another source of funding we got recently is Harvard Grid funding. So the Harvard Grid Accelerator has given Yost Vlasic and I some funds to continue core R&D on this for another year. I think at the end of that project, we will be in a position to seek some VC funding. We're thankful enough to be in a position where we don't imminently need it right now.
Yeah.
I think this is a really good project for SBIRs, STTRs, things like that, because it has attracted a lot of government interest, things like NSF. So,
yeah. As you approach that in the next year, I want to dive into a little bit for our audience, how you went about building the team. Mm-hmm. So you and Angela are co-founders of this venture. Tell us about your mindset or how this formed into this partnership between you two.
Well, Angela and I met, when I first entered grad school. We both worked on this project for a time. And she's of more an entrepreneurial mindset than I am. And so I think she right away saw that there was, an entrepreneurial possibility here. We kind of, we didn't do anything with it for a while, but as the research results came in, it looked more and more promising. And, we talked about it and decided, hey, I think we should go for it. We worked really well together in lab and thought that would translate well to a startup, and it has so far. Right now, we're the only two members of the team, but we'll try expanding this summer, looking for probably more technical help than anything.
That is definitely very interesting. But you're only so new, right? You're 6 to 8 months in terms of a formal entity. What was kind of the discussion like about the future of your company in the mindset of like, often for yourself, perhaps, right? Founder versus going out alone versus was a team for a new venture. What was your kind of thought process for a partnership?
I think it would have been impossible to do alone. So, I think there's just, in order to be efficient and apply for grants and respond to even just the slew of emails, like you have to have a partner to do it. And, that's why it just made sense for Angela and I to work together. And we had kind of a similar synergy in lab. So that's translated pretty well to the startup so far.
Definitely. Well, let's talk also a little bit about the future of this technology, perhaps. It seems like it could be a technology that solves something in a space that our existing technologies don't. What do you believe is kind of like in this space? Is there any other companies out there doing a similar research or venture? Or often, as we learn in entrepreneurship, you're kind of like the first to market with this application.
Yeah, not to our knowledge. We don't know of any other company that's pursuing this kind of levitation tech. There are there's hardware out there that's in adjacent spaces. So if you look at the actual applications of what we're doing, if you want to use our platforms for telecoms, the next closest thing would be like a Starlink. If you want to look at these things for atmospheric sensing, the next closest thing would be high altitude balloons, or in some cases satellites where they just look down with LiDAR or SAR. Yeah. So we have unique advantages over those competing technologies depending on what the application is. Like I said, for telecoms, you have 1/5 the latency. For atmospheric sensing, you really unlock a new region of data. Yeah. That answers the question.
Well, let's dive into, it's just, this is not just, this sounds like great. Let's have a discussion on also the trappings or potential moral hazards of this technology. We've seen with satellites, now that Starlink is launched, Blue Origin, I believe, is also trying to launch a satellite network. We've seen an increasing proliferation of satellites. Probably like a majority, 80% of all satellites were launched in the last 5 or 10 years. And there's an increasing hazard of space debris or a cascade of one satellite hitting another, and those, parts. That was a big concern, especially, and becoming an ever greater concern. And your technology, as it scales, is aiming to fill this other segment of our atmosphere. Does that solve this problem of space debris? Is there other concerns with the technology? Could there be an overproliferation? Does that lead to any sort of major issues?
So one of the great things about what we're working on is that they don't orbit. So whenever they reach their end of life, they'll fall back down through the troposphere, and then surface weather will just disintegrate these devices. And they're made out of non-toxic ceramic. So they basically become mineral dust once they're finished performing what they're doing. So there's no worry of space junk from our tech.
And this area of space, is it above national airspace? I can imagine if it's floating around to other countries, they might be a little concerned about that.
Yeah, so that's kind of an area we haven't delved into very much yet. We need to look at the kind of regulatory concerns and stuff. These devices are so lightweight that you face a lot of FAA regulations when you start lofting things that are greater than 250 grams in terms of weight. We're definitely under that right now, but there's still concerns in terms of communications. Like if you're doing anything with the U.S., it needs to go through the FCC. Obviously, we haven't even touched the defense space yet, but there's going to be a world of stuff to deal with there. Wish I could speak more to it, but
no worries.
It's a complicated area, and we're still learning about it.
You're just building technology first, right? What do you think is ultimately the greatest challenge this technology might be able to help in terms of like society, the major problems? You mentioned the idea that, you mentioned the inspiration for this was your mentor and tackling potentially heating global climate change issues initially. What do you think is like potentially the first product or the first opportunities that this technology could really add value?
I am most excited about, and I think the first product would be using these devices to take atmospheric measurements. Even a few simple measurements could be very useful towards climate models. You wouldn't need that many devices to start getting real interesting data. Just improving the accuracy of climate models could reduce, humanity's carbon output by hundreds of millions of tons per year. And that has wide ramifications, and it's reflected in a number of industries. So for instance, if you know what atmospheric weather looks like, you can better optimize aviation routes. You can inform farmers of when best to harvest or plant their crops. Even insurance would be interested, because a lot of there's a lot of damages incurred from climate change more and more as we as catastrophic weather events get worse. So it touches a number of industries. It's why I am most excited about this technology, and I think that's really where the potential for good from this technology comes from.
Absolutely. You're at the end of your time here at Harvard. This podcast focuses on students and alums, and you're at the threshold now. Um, what is your immediate plans, in the next few months after your thesis is defended, let's say, and you successfully get your PhD? Is this a venture that you're going to be dedicating your full-time attention to as your co-founder?
It is, yeah. So we're both fully committed to working on this, and I think exactly what we do is obviously going to depend on what funding opportunities come through. But we're thankful enough to have gotten this fellowship with Los Alamos National Lab, so we'll probably spend a good amount of time out there. We have access to their clean room, and we may continue to do some work at Harvard CNS here. We're also a member of Greentown Labs, so it'll be a little bit of a balancing act trying to figure out where it makes sense for us to be. Some of that will be determined by funding, but yeah, we're just excited to be working on it full time. So.
Absolutely. Tackling this, of course, seems to be pushing the bleeding edge of new technology. What has been, in your experience, the biggest challenge or the biggest hurdle that you've experienced thus far in scaling both this venture and technology?
So I think technologically, these devices are very lightweight, and they can be. It's really an interesting material science problem, right? You've got a very lightweight device that can levitate on its own. The more weight you put on it, the stronger the device can be, but also the lower payload capacity you have. So that's been a fun and difficult science problem to tackle. The other problem, more on the commercial side, is that because this is such an emerging technology, it's so greenfield, we're still learning about potential use cases every time we talk with someone. So that's why we were really excited to do the I-Corps program. If anyone listening is interested in talking with us about potential uses for these devices, please reach out. But there's still a lot to learn, is basically what it comes down to.
Absolutely. What do you feel is really vital in terms of scaling? You're building a physical product, a very advanced physical product, and there are a lot of software products entirely different. For physical product venture out there, where you're doing the research, often in an academic setting or a very heavy industry setting. For those founders, what might be some advice that you would give them for building out a venture that is producing something in terms of technology, a physical product, perhaps that is very advanced, that of course isn't software based?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice I could give would be to get out of the lab. That was the most useful thing. It's I think NSF.
What does that mean, to get out of the lab?
Yeah.
And the national laboratory system, can you go briefly into that?
Oh, sure. So to get out of the lab, meaning like the research is great, but you don't have a company unless you know that there are people that will use what you're working on. And so maybe NSF has trademarked that phrase, but one of the great things that we learned from I-Corps was that you really do need to go talk to people that could potentially buy and use your technology. Otherwise, it's really just research that you're working on.
Right.
And it's been super useful to figure out, you need to talk to people, you need to talk to actual customers to know you're not going to be able to guess by just sitting in the lab and working on the thing. Sorry, what was the other part of the question that you asked?
You mentioned, of course, the Los Alamos Labs. This seems to be an incredible source of innovation and support for, a lot of these advanced technologies. Can you give kind of a little bit of a background explanation about this resource? It's not just this one lab. There's many labs in the United States. Yeah,
so the National Lab System is great. I actually worked at Los Alamos for a year before grad school. And what this fellowship is it's a LEAP fellowship. So I think the most well-known one is the Activate Fellowship. That's out of Berkeley National Lab. But more and more national labs are starting these programs. I think Argonne has one, NREL has one, and it's basically a way to start getting more innovation into the national labs. National labs can sometimes be this kind of like, old bureaucratic way of getting science done, and it's in some ways kind of the polar opposite of industry, where industry, it's like profit driven, you're moving very quickly. National labs, I think, take their time more. It's not to say they don't do fantastic research. They do. But I think trying to combine the good elements of both is what these programs are all about. So really excited to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, let's dive a little bit into, what is really fostering a lot of these innovations in academia. This has been a big thing in terms of, we've had this increasing skepticism of universities and research and their role in society. And yet you're offering, the importance of academia and research producing actual technological innovations. What has it been like to be in a kind of a purely academic setting versus this kind of more entrepreneurial and that you're experiencing the last year?
Yeah, it's kind of a whole new world. I am very much a dorky scientist type. And so, really transitioning more into that MBA mindset has been difficult. And thankfully, Angela brings a lot of that to the table. I mean, she's fantastic and, has like an econ background. That's really where we complement each other in terms of skill sets, I think. But yeah, so I think just like trying to deprogram myself from the more academic mindset where everything is like you're super focused on the results and what's this next paper going to be. All that stuff is important, but you need to network. You need to talk with people, and dorky scientist type. I'm used to just kind of hermiting up in the lab for all day and not talking to many people. But I think it's been a rewarding experience. So.
Yeah. So you're a part of SEAS, I believe. It's the School of Engineering, and at Harvard University. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to pursue your PhD here? What is the particular renown that perhaps SEAS or Harvard has for hard science? Because people often look at MIT or Caltech, a lot of these other very, of course, research, even more research-heavy institutions to pursue, something in the sciences.
Well, on one hand, it was, Harvard was kind of the best school that I got into for grad school. And if you get into Harvard, you kind of go to Harvard.
Yeah.
And the other part was that I found the best research fit here. So I was really excited by the potential of doing research with David Keith. It sounded like the actual research was a good fit for my interests at the time. So that drew me in, and happy I came. So.
Yeah. What was your undergraduate and post-undergraduate experience like prior to Harvard? Tell us a little bit about your beginnings in that sense.
Sure. Well, I grew up not too far from here, Dover, Mass. And went to college in upstate New York at Hamilton College. There I majored in physics and chemistry, and really just fell in love with the hard sciences, so much so that I went to work at Los Alamos for a year in between undergrad and grad school. And when I was out there, I was applying to grad school and got it here. And yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Do you see a lot of opportunities for funding in terms of in the academic setting for these more advanced like technologies? Is this something that others can also pursue? Do you feel like do you feel there's, I guess, funding? Because a lot of it comes from, of course, the government. It comes from the university itself. But do you see like a major source of opportunities for funding these new ventures? Because in the larger venture space, VC funding right now is in a period of let's say difficulty because a period of free money has dried up essentially with the interest rates.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of it comes from taking the initiative to say apply for that NSF proposal or apply for transitional opportunities like Harvard Grid. I'm very thankful of Harvard for providing a lot of opportunities like the grid that have really propelled the research. But yeah, I would say, certainly if you're a grad student working on something interesting, there's no reason not to apply. If you're looking to transition your research, there's no reason not to apply for as many things as you can, so long as you have the time, which I think is the limiting factor.
Very true.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, the advantages of applying for like non-dilutive funding, the grants for these national institutions, from national institutions or academic grants? I think people don't typically see that as a source of model in certain fields of entrepreneurship. What why was that like the first idea or the first location to look for yourself?
I think, we're very early. We want to not dilute ourselves as much as possible early on. We still have a lot of technical risks, so finding partners in academia and places like national labs, where they have the scientific expertise to help move the technology along, is something that we really need. So that's what made us focus on that as opposed to VC funding from out the gate. I do think, we'll probably transition to VC funding at the right time. And, I've heard of people doing both. There are people that just go right for VC funding, and there are also companies that just subsist off of SBIRs. Different strategies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry if I don't have a better answer to that.
No worries. I think that's, there's never one right path. There's ultimately multiple paths for people to take, and podcast is just to show them that there are. I think as much as we like to learn about technologies, the venture itself, a lot of founders themselves are a critical element of any successful ventures. And often it is not just the technologies that VCs believe in, but VCs believe in ultimately the founders themselves. So I think a good thing to illustrate is also, what is your mentality and approach towards building a company and building a viable technology assist? What do you do in terms of your worldview in thinking about why do this to make the most impact?
Well, man, that's a complicated question. I'll give you a simple answer, which is just, I think climate is the biggest motivating thing for me. And so working on technology that can help solve some of the impending climate crises are, that's just very fulfilling to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's, I don't know. It's, I'm just happy to be working on it. And I think that being in control of where the research goes is more fulfilling right now than my expectation value would have been if I just went into industry. I think that it's very empowering to be able to guide research, and in a lot of ways, this is, it's almost like trying to build a scientific career, but also seeing the translation happen to a point where you can make social change.
Absolutely. How have you ultimately, you balance the requirements of this company and also your academic requirements? That's you're doing a PhD. That's your life. You're doing this company now for the last half a year, a little more. How has that balance been for you?
Hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of coffee and no sleep, but getting through it.
Definitely. Well, I think we've touched on the main points and we learned a little bit more about a very interesting venture. So I just want to thank you, Ben, for coming on my podcast and your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You as well.